I'm not an expert on all this. I've just had a few experiences of looking at war military records, etc. And I've had to work out what things were and how it works. It tells you what your ancestors did in the war. That's a fairly obvious sort of statement. But secondly, it tells you something about them. Were they heroes? Were they villains? Were they brave? Were they cowardly? Did they behave themselves? Or were they always being sent to detention barracks? It gives you information about their whereabouts during a period of their lives. So suddenly you'll have a few years while they were serving in the military service. You'll see where they were, what they were doing. But that part you do have to do yourself. You do have to find out. It'll tell you where they are, but what happened then is up to you to find out. And if your ancestors are South African, the record will tell you, actually, believe it or not, a bit about their politics and their political leanings. Because on the military stamp for the Second World War, on the military form, you'll find a stamp labeled anywhere. And I'll come back to that when we reach that and explain exactly what I mean by that and how it talks about your politics. And finally, it helps you to make your ancestors appear to be more rounded characters, not just people who've got a name, a birth date, a marriage date, and a date of death, but rather to get to know them better as people. Now, there are three conflicts I'm going to look at, and there are conflicts before the Anglo-Boer War, obviously. There's all the frontier wars in the Eastern Cape, and there's also wars after the Second World War, including the Korean War, the border conflict, the invasion of Angola, and so on and so on. I'm not going to deal with those today, but merely looking at these three: Anglo-Boer War, World War I, and World War II. Now, if anyone's done any research on Anglo-Boer War, I'm sure they've gone to this website, angloboerwar.com. Wonderful website if you want to look up your ancestor who might have served in either UK forces or in the local South African units that were set up during the war. When it comes to the overseas forces, there is a database on the site of all those who were awarded the Queen's South Africa Medal. And these will give you all the different persons' names, and you can see on the top next to there, I'm pointing to it with my mouse arrow at the moment, it says name search, so you can click on that, enter your ancestor's name, and hopefully it'll appear and give you the regiment he served in. But it also has some records of the nominal rolls, that is to say, the list of all those serving in South African regiments. And in particular, I've taken a picture at random of the Ashburners Light Horse Regiment. So you can see I've got the page starting with the letter K, and you can see the list of people there. On the right, it says medal awarded, and I'll come back to that. In the stat column there is the service number, the name and Christian name of the serviceman, his rank, the date in which he was enlisted, and then the date he was discharged. And you'll see one of them down here, William Jenner King, was actually discharged when he was killed on the 7th of March, 1902 at Klipdrift. Others got discharged to other regiments. I'm not quite sure. I can't read those last two. Something, it's a town corps or something corps, horse corps or something like that. And he was discharged from the Ashburner Light Horse into the Kimberley Corps there. So you can get quite a lot of information just from that nominal roll. It's not just a matter of names and numbers. Coming back to this here, I couldn't work out what KCR was, but on that same Anglo-Boer War website, there is a reference to a forum, and the forum is a discussion group, and someone had asked that very fact, what does KCR stand for? And the decision was, it stands for the King's Clasp Received. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what this forum said. You see, the nominal rolls were used to track the awarding of medals, and the King's Clasp was awarded to those who were still serving after the death of Queen Victoria, and they could add this clasp to their South African medal, the QSA, as it's invariably abbreviated to. And then I was particularly interested in the Kimberley crowd because my maternal family come from Kimberley. And you can see this is the Kimberley Town Guard. and they were awarded the South African medal, which is the same as the Queen's South African medal. And they were given the clasp, and it says yes in that column, for the defense of Kimberley. The family I'm interested in are the Kennett family. And let me show you a larger version so you can see it more clearly. There's Kennett HJ, who's Henry Jacob, and he got the defense of Kimberley. And then Kennett WR, and it's got a line through it. He's William Roberts. He got a line through it because it was actually issued by the Kimberley Regiment and not by the Kimberley Town Guard. And that's the picture of the Queen's South African medal below. Before moving away from the Anglo-Boer War, I really must mention this website, the British concentration camps of the South African War, 1900 to 1902. Many of you might remember that Professor Elizabeth van Heinigen came and gave a talk to our society a couple of years ago about this website and this database. A very useful database if you have any family who were on the Boer side. For example, I'm researching the St. Paul's graveyard. There is a Reuven family, and one of them married into an Afrikaner family, and in fact, he ended up in one of the concentration camps and died in that concentration camp. And I could trace his records and his family through that. A very useful website, really worthwhile keeping a record of. I don't think I've made a copy of that in the set of sources, which I have sent on to Anne, and hopefully she will be able to forward it to you, or you can ask me to forward it to you at the end of this presentation. Let's move on to the First World War. When we come to the First World War, there's two separate sort of ways of looking at it. The one way is from the British Army perspective. So if your ancestor served in the trenches in the British Army at all, those records will obviously be in the UK, and I'll talk more about those shortly. If they were in the South African Defence Forces, those records are kept in the Pretoria, in the archives of the Union Defence Force of the Department of Defence. I believe the archives have moved to Centurion, and you'll have to get someone to do the looking up for you. And they are those records are going to be very similar to the ones for the Second World War. So I won't look at those now, but rather just look at the British records, the UK records. The most likely thing you'll find when you search online will be the medal cards. This is an example of the medal card of Francis de Monte. He served, first of all, in the Queen's Regiment as a private, and that's his regimental number, 56080. And then later he moved to the Labour Corps. And you'll see here that he was awarded the Victory Medal and the British Medal. If he had signed up before 1914, he would have got the 1914-1918 star as well. On the back of this postcard-sized medal card is room for correspondence. On quite a few of them, they will have references to letters written to them, and they'll have the address to which they sent the medals at the end of the war. Obviously, Francis de Monte never applied for his medal, so there's no correspondence or address there. And that's a picture of the two famous medals. There's a third medal, of course, the 1914 star, which is not in that picture, but those are the three medals that most people who served in the First World War received. Now, the other records, the personal records, you'll find were stored by the British Army or the British Defence Department after the First World War, but they put them in a large warehouse in London. And unfortunately, in the Second World War, a firebomb dropped on the warehouse and damaged and destroyed a large number of those records. Here's Mr. de Monte's records, which were there, and you can see he gets transferred from the Queen's Regiment because he was injured. He's on it. There's a casualty form filled in by him. But you'll also notice there's this damage to the record, and over here you can see water damage. This is because he was one of the records that could be saved. A large number, of course, were burnt. Of the 7 million documents, only 2.1 million documents have been saved. And generally, you'll find references to this in the most genealogical sites as being part of the burnt document. So if you see that, that's what is meant by that. If you want to find out more about what your ancestor did, like Mr. De Monte, what did he do when he was in the Queen's Regiment? Well, you could actually go to the National Archives in Kew. You can look on their website and see if they have the war diaries of that particular regiment. And if you know he was injured on a certain date, you can actually look and see what the regiment was doing on that certain date. So taking that information from this form here, you can actually then look up on the war diaries and see what he was doing on that what the regiment was doing on that day and how well they served. Now, while we're talking about people who died in the First World War and the Second World War, there's one website which is most useful, and that's the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website. It's under cwgc.org. And this is the opening page of that website. And you can find records, and there's quite a lot of information on this website. You've got to search it a bit to get what you want. I know that one of my Kennet ancestors, in fact, died in German Southwest Africa. And so I looked for his name, and there he is, John William Kennet, a private in the South African Railway Services. He's a South African as his nationality. He died on the 2nd of September 1915. He was a 20-year-old, and he's in the Windhoek Municipal Cemetery. And interesting that the road in which you'll find this old municipal cemetery is the Robert Mugabe Road in Windhoek. And if you look here, it says more details. And if you click on that, I'm not going to do that now, but if you do click on that, it'll give you the record of all the others buried in that site and what grave number he is. And I think it even includes an overall picture of the Commonwealth War Graves section of that old municipal cemetery in Windhoek. And it might give you the name of his next of kin and maybe even the words that they asked to be put on the grave. So once again, you can get quite a lot of information if any of your ancestors died during the First or Second World War. And now we come to the Second World War. I don't know how well you know, but the chap down here, second on the right, bottom, do you know who that is?
Ian Smith.
That's right. That is the former Prime Minister of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, in his Royal Air Force uniform. And the chap completely on the right is my father, Tom Pratt, who served in the Royal Navy, and we'll hear more about him shortly. So World War II records. Now, very few of these are online. The ones that tend to be online are the UK records, usually the officers only, and they appear either in the Navy lists and also the promotions of Army, Air Force, and others who received dramatic awards. I'm trying to think of ones: Victoria Cross, obviously, Distinguished Flying Cross, Military Medal. Those ones will appear as awarded in the London Gazette. So it's also quite useful to do a search there, and I'll give you that website at the end. Navy lists. The only thing I find disappointing about the Navy list, that doesn't tell you it'll tell you all the lieutenants in the executive branch or all the lieutenant commanders in the engineering branch and their date of promotion, in other words, their seniority in the list, but it won't tell you which unit they were serving on at that point. But it does give you proof that one of your ancestors was in the Navy at that point. South African records, well, they're available in the Defence Force archives, can only be obtained through a regular researcher. There was a bit of an issue over this in the past, and even Dewald Nel was banned from using any researching. He managed to finally get permission. I use Dewald Nel. I don't know if anyone else does, has done. He's very useful and recommended by many on the Facebook South African Genealogy group. They all, whenever someone talks about military service, everyone says, ask Dewald, ask Dewald. So he's certainly the most popular person for that. Most of the examples, in fact, the only example I'm giving you is my father-in-law, and his records were collected for me by Dewald, and obviously for a fee. And my father's RN records I already had, so I didn't have to research those. So what might you receive from DeWalt? What might he send you? Well, what did you do in the war, Daddy, is not going to be simply answered by him, unfortunately. Why not? Well, for the simple reason that the file and the card, the personal file and the service card, are simply admin documents used by the Defence Force to post your ancestor where they are needed at a certain time. They'll merely give you the date of the arrival in a unit, the date of departure from that unit. They will not tell you where the unit is serving. It won't say in Italy or anything like that. That you'll have to research yourself. The information will also be in the form of acronyms and abbreviations and jargon, which during the World War II, the users would easily understand, but somewhat at 70 odd years now later, we perhaps battle to know exactly what they mean. Thirdly, further research, and here I've underlined it, done by you, has to be done by you to learn more about the unit that your ancestor served in and what happened during the time period your ancestor was in that unit. What else will the file tell you? Well, maybe give you a bit of medical history, especially if the person was wounded or suffered from a disease that required admission to hospital, bronchitis, pneumonia, gastroenteritis, or something like that. And that'll be on the sheet in the service record. It'll also tell you how your ancestor behaved, his personal conduct, especially if they're brought before an officer for a disciplinary hearing. And I'll show you one of those as we get further on. When you get a record from DeWalt, he will put it in Dropbox and tell you that he's put it in Dropbox. Click on this link and you'll find in Dropbox something like this. This is my father-in-law's South African Air Force records, 336494 Ronald Edward Jones P. And the second one with the same name, but this time labeled S, both of them PDF documents, one quite large and one 14 megabytes, one 1.8 megabytes. The S, I should imagine, stands for service card, which is a simple two-sided card. P stands for personal file, which will tell you and contain other bits of information. And it's quite a few pages, and that's why it's a much bigger file. You download those files and you open them up and you can then work with them. So let's explore Ronald Edward Jones' personal file and his service card. Here's the service card. If you look at the bottom where that blue arrow is showing, you'll see it says Jones RE, and with his number 336494. V stands for volunteer because he volunteered for the war time period. On the top, it gives you his details again. It gives you the date he was attested, in other words, he swore an oath to fight, and it'll give you the date of birth of Ronald Edward Jones, and it also give you the courses he did, BT, and once again I had to look this up and work out what it was, but it stands for basic training, and FME, which stands for flight mechanic engineering, and he passed both of those courses. And it also gives you the next of kin. And you'll see here there's his name and number again. This is another card. I think it's labeled card 1 at the top there. And then next in the yellow arrow points to his where his next of kin, his father, Edward Jones, was living, and he moved around quite a lot in South Africa. As you can see, he was Alwell North, and then in Johannesburg, and so on, and then in Cape Town. In the green arrow, it points to the medals that Ronald Edward Jones was awarded. And if you look across there, also in red writing, it says 6352. That's when the medals were finally dispatched to him. It took right until 1952 before the medals were actually sent to him. And also gives you record of his discharge and the dates in which he was discharged. But most interesting of all is the top there, where it says anywhere stamped on his card. As men joined the military service, they had to swear allegiance. And many Afrikaans citizens of South Africa were not willing to fight against Hitler, but they were willing to defend their own land, but they weren't willing to leave South Africa. And so in 1940, a so-called Red Oath or Africa Service Oath was taken by volunteers from the Union Defence Force, the UDF, and they're willing to serve anywhere in Africa as long as World War II lasted. And then 3 years later, in 1943, a new oath, the General Service Oath, was taken by those members of the armed forces willing to serve anywhere in the world during World War II. Those who took the oath wore red tabs on their uniform, red flashes, and they were often referred to as being red tabs. And on their personnel file, you'll find that stamp anywhere appearing, so that when someone had to station these people during the war, they could look at this service card such as this, see that red stamp and say anywhere stamp, and could send them off to Italy if necessary. So where did he serve? Well, if you look at the date he attested to the date he was finally discharged, he was in the Air Force for 4 years and 229 days. And the whole of those 4 years and 229 days are summarized in 13 lines on this card. So it doesn't tell you that much about his service record, except where he was and when he was there. So let's look at these bit by bit. First of all, he signed up as an aircraftman, as a basic trainee on 1 shilling a day, and that was in 1942, and he was at the 100th Air School, which in fact at Voortrekker, and I used a website called British Commonwealth Air Training Facilities in South Africa. A very useful website if any of your ancestors served in the Air Force, even the Royal Air Force, because a lot of Royal Air Force pilots were trained in this country. And the 100th Air School is at Voortrekker, it told me, where regimental training took place. So I presume that's the sort of basic training that you do when you join up a military service, marching, saluting, disciplinary sort of training, and so on. The second entry, you will see it says Flight Mechanic ER, which is trainee, 1 and 6 a day now. And he was at the 71st Air School, and the 71st Air School was in fact in Milner Park in Johannesburg. It's been taken over now by Wits University, but there he learned about fixing aircraft engine. Then in 1942, he was stationed this time to the, now receiving 5 shillings a day, to the 70th Air School, which is at Alexanderfontein near Kimberley. Which is interesting. My mom was in Kimberley. Now having seen these dates, I wonder if my mom ever bumped into him somewhere in the Kimberley streets or something. And then there's now as a qualified, no longer a trainee, flight mechanic engineer, 6 shillings a day. He was attached at the 6th Air School in Potchefstroom. This was a pilot training school where many pilots learned to fly, and they were flying on Tiger Moths. So he obviously learned to maintain the engines that drove those Tiger Moth planes. In 1943, his mustering is now listed as being flight mechanic AF. I thought it was AT, but after talking to Dewald Nell about this, he suggested it was AT, which is aircraft fitter, which is what his mustering was. But now he's stationed at something called a MAFD. Once again, it was a lot of searching, and I'll show you later where I finally found what those initials stood for, but they stand for Mobile Air Force Depot. Basically, it was the depot where aircraftmen would be stationed until such time as they could be sent to where they were required. And in this case, he was sent in 1944 up to the Middle East. E Squadron, I should imagine, is the squadron that flew from South Africa up to the Middle East. ME stands for Middle East. He was then placed into you'll notice there's only 3-day difference between that entry and the next one. That's mostly how long it took to fly from South Africa up to the Middle East. And he was placed in the SBD. Once again, more searching, and I discovered that stands for South African Air Force Base Depot. Same thing as the MAFD, but this time overseas with slightly different initials. So he was there waiting to be stationed into a squadron or into an airfield. And he was sent onto the 227th Squadron. That is, in fact, a RAF squadron. But more and more, so I discovered by reading the history on Google, more and more of the South African Air Force personnel were stationed there. And so they renamed the squadron and gave it a South African Air Force numbering, the 19th Squadron. And he served in that squadron for over a year and 3 months. Sorry, 2 months short of a year, before he was sent off to an advanced training camp in June 1945, which is quite interesting. Why they want to send someone on an advanced training camp 2 months or a month after VE Day, I'm not sure, but I don't run the Air Force. So, and after a month at that, or 20, 30 days at that training camp, he was transferred to the second wing. I asked Diewold about that. He suggested it was a pile of squadrons were based on the second wing. So I suspect he was just working, repairing engines and the like there, before going back to the South African Air Force Base Depot in November 1945 and being shipped back to South Africa, where he fell into a similar mobile Air Force depot on the 8th of the 12th, 1945. And from there, it doesn't show it on this chart, but I'll show you later on, he was transferred to Westlake, where he was discharged from the Air Force. So those 13 lines sum up exactly what he did and where he was. But you can get a bit more from the personal file. That's just the service record, service card. And so a bit of further research on Google gave me more information about the different squadrons and so on. And then I'll show you a few photos in Ronald Jones's own old photo album. And all of these add flesh to those 13-line card, which you've been looking at. First of all, this is his attestation papers when he signed on to the Air Force. Here you see Ronald E. Jones signing on to the South African Air Force. Interesting to see, he's 16 years and 10 months when he signed on. And here we find both his daughter and I find it quite fascinating. So I've muted everyone. I hope that's okay. Right. Here's the attestation papers. I don't think there's much detail I need to point out here, but you'll notice down here is the Anywhere stamp appearing once again. And this is the actual oath he had to take. I won't read the first part, which is that they'll bear true allegiance to King George VI, etc. But just read the important one, that in accordance with the resolution of Parliament, I will serve in the South African Active Citizen Force in Africa, whether within or outside the limits of South Africa for the duration of the present war. And that's what Ronald Jones, 16-year-old and 10 months, signed up for in 1942. So he must have signed another one to serve elsewhere in the world in 1943 when that second oath came out. His conduct sheet, and this is what I'm talking about, how they, whoops, I've gone too far, let me go back one. That's what I'm talking about, seeing my father-in-law misbehaved himself. Well, that's a matter of opinion. On the 31st of March, 1943, he, contrary to Section 11, neglecting to obey standing orders, having taxied an aircraft. There are two witnesses to that, and he was deprived of 3 days' pay in lieu of 6 days CB. I'm not sure if CB stands for detention barracks or if it stands for confined to barracks. I'm not quite sure what that stands for. And the person who heard the hearing was Wing Commander Cox. I suspect that he was repairing a plane. Having finished it, he wanted to get it out of the air shed and out onto the runway, and he taxied it out himself, and he wasn't supposed to do that. And so he was brought before the wing commander for that. Now, Ronald Jones served in Italy, and I've discovered this by finding out the history of the 19th Squadron. The 19th South African Air Force Squadron flew Bristol Beaufighters, a very nice, sharp and clear picture I found online of one of those Bristol Beaufighter. And then this other picture taken here at the Biferno airstrip in Italy shows SAAF and RAF flight crew. And that's what the label said in the Imperial War Museum records. You'll notice under here are rockets that were fired by this aircraft. And these are by the pilots from both the SAAF and the Royal Air Force. What did the 19th Squadron do? Well, you'll see here there was a book by Stephen Stevens, who won the Distinguished Flying Cross, and he tells of the South African Air Force's time in Italy, and he says from the Balkans Air Force. So that squadron served in what was called the Balkans Air Force, and their task was to fire rockets at the German-occupied Yugoslavia across the other side of the Adriatic Sea. And also in this picture here, which as you can see, it says 19 SAAF, and at the far end here it says Lieutenant Stevens, so he was flight lieutenant at that point, and Dan Tilley was his commanding officer, and they were flying this Beaufighter, and with rockets, you can see them shooting through the air there at this German ship in a Greek port. There are very few pictures of this Biferno airfield. This river coming out of the sea here is the Biferno River, and there's the airfield there between the two plains. It's right on the beach, and therefore it's a small wonder that now it's under the waters of the Adriatic Sea and can no longer be seen. And these are two Beaufighters, Bristol Beaufighters. And then from Ronald Jones's own photo album, these are 4 pictures I found. None of them are labeled in the usual style of our ancestors. They never seem to label pictures, and we just have to guess. So I should imagine by the look of this airfield material to make the sandy beach of Biferno able to take planes landing and taking off, I should imagine this is at Biferno, the whole 19th Squadron SAAF. And so somewhere in this picture is Ronald Jones, my father-in-law. The second picture in the middle here are the air mechanics, and we're guessing that that's him there in the middle. But what is fascinating is the black man sitting here in front. There have been quite a lot of articles written about how they were not allowed to be part of, black South Africans were not allowed to be part of active military units, and ended up digging trenches or latrines or guarding prisoners, and that's about all. So it's interesting that this group of South African mechanics were happy to have this black gentleman taken in the picture with them, considered to be part of the unit with them. The top right picture there is Ronnie Jones and his mate messing around. And we've got to remember that when this picture was taken, he was about 18 or 19 years old. And then the bottom picture here of throwing 4 mechanics busy pretending to fix the wheel assembly of a Bristol Beaufighter. And then going through his personal file, suddenly in the middle of all that, I found this. Record of service and particulars of discharge of 336495V Airman Erasmus Johann Christian. I just hope that Johann Christian's descendants aren't looking for his discharge papers today. Obviously, this was filed in the wrong file. If you remember, 336496 was Ronald Jones's service number. So obviously this got put into the wrong file. But here, in fact, are Ronald Jones's discharge papers. Just some interesting facts on this before we move on. The first one was that he's entitled to demobilization benefits, and they listed below here, £30 civilian clothing and a cash allowance granted. He was quite lucky because he was had a job lined up. He was going to be a trainee checker on the South African Railways and Harbours in Cape Town. Also quite amusing when you come to the second page, you can see his 4 years and 229 days of serving in the UDF, the Union Defence Force. and no, it says less the periods without pay. It says nil. Well, we know he lost 3 days pay, but that didn't get entered on this form. And then over here, his character is good, his sobriety is sober, and his efficiency is efficient. Right. So that's the end of the of the South African Air Force entry. I don't know if any of you have any questions about that before I go on to the Royal Navy records of my father.
I would just like to make a remark, Jaco this side.
Yes, please feel side.
Interesting, the mesh they used on that beach runway. The Americans used the same type of thing in the Pacific Islands, where they had a problem with the sand on the islands.
Okay.
So it's very interesting the mesh they use for if the aircraft are a bit on the heavy side, that they don't fall into the sand. Interesting.
Well, the Beaufighters didn't look that large, so I expect it was easier for those.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to the Royal Navy records? Are you any more questions? You can ask at the end as well. I just thought maybe it's a good time for a tea break. How did someone put it? Liquid in or liquid out is now a good opportunity.
Derek,
I don't
know if you can hear me.
Yes.
It's John Robertson. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, John.
Sorry, not a question, just a little aside. I also have Kimberley origin, so I could identify with you there. I grew up in Kimberley, and my parents lived in Kimberley. Yeah.
Oh, right. You must maybe contact me, and I can look at my mother's birthday book, and maybe your parents appear in that as children or something like that.
Yeah. Just maybe I should contact you. Yeah. Thank you.
I usually rudely say that to my mother and to my aunt or my great aunt. Everyone seems to have lived in Kimberley at some stage. So,
yes. Well, it was the place to be many years ago.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Anyway. But thank you, Derek. Thank you.
Let me move on to the second set now. This is looking at World War II Royal Navy records for Thomas Pratt, and that's him in the middle over there, and some of the ships he served on during that time. Now, this is his certificate of service that when anyone leaves the Royal Navy, they hand this back to them. Up until about 1970, that happened. And as you can see, I was fortunate. When I started showing an interest in my family history, my mother said to me, well, since you're doing the family history, you better have this. And she gave me this Royal Navy service record, which I've been an absolute fascinating source of information for me. Firstly, you can see the name at the top. Secondly, you can see what they call port division, and that is where he signed on to the Royal Navy, and that says Chatham in Kent. And then his number, SSX 20553. It also gives you his signing on date, and in fact that he was signed on for 12 years, SS, which stands for short service. So he was only serving for 7 years full-time in the Royal Navy and 5 years in the Royal Navy Reserve. This is 1937, so it's 2 years before the Second World War happened. Also on the sheet is his next of kin, which is his mother, Sarah, and that's where she lived. I've actually been there. It's one of the municipal city council housing that she lived in Birmingham. I think it's been sold since then, of course, but you'll notice it's been crossed out. That's because my father got married halfway through the war, and therefore his next of kin became my mother, his wife. Just to give you a brief, this up top here, there's you'll notice it says cut along here. When I first got this sheet, I contacted through a question and answer type forum, the Royal Navy Association in South Africa. And a lot of them said they knew my dad and so on. And one of them said, I hope the sheet hasn't got the top right-hand corner cut off. So I said, no, it's all there. He said, oh, good, because if it has, it means he's been dishonorably discharged from the Navy. So at least my father wasn't dishonorably discharged. Just to give you a breakdown of the port divisions, there were three of them. I think there's only two now: Chatham, Devonport or Plymouth, and Portsmouth. The short service, I've explained, the 7 years plus 5 years in the reserve. And my father fell under the Seamen and Communications branch. He actually became a gunnery rating. And the X after the number, after the SSX, it used to have the port division name. So it would be C in case of for my father. But from 1930 onwards, they had X put there. But my father, I must admit, was still very proud of the fact that he enlisted at Chatham and not at Portsmouth or Devonport or Plymouth. But the most important is the second page. And there you see his name at the top. But this is where the nitty-gritty is, the list of the different units he served in. It gives you also the rank, or as they call it, the rating. He started as an ordinary seaman and ended up by the end of the war as being a petty officer. It also gives you his date in which he arrived in the unit and the date in which he departed. And you have to then take that information and work out what that unit, that ship in this case, was doing between those two dates. So let's take the top four records first of all. It says Pembroke. Now, I sort of looked for a ship called Pembroke on Google and also asked the Royal Navy Association, and they said it's a stone frigate. Now, if you don't know where that term comes from, I'll give you the definition on the left there. It's a naval establishment on the land. I know when I joined the Navy in Simonstown, I did my basic training at SAS Simonsburg. And that was definitely on the land. There was no ship that we went on board. But the term has its origins in the Royal Navy, where they had a island near Martinique called Diamond Rock. And this island became a sloop of war because the Navy wasn't supposed to have control over any land at all. And so they ran it like a ship, as a commissioned ship. So HMS Pembroke is in fact the Navy base based at Chatham Dockyard in Kent and on the Midway River, which leads into the Thames. And my dad was there from April to November, 8 months. And that was basic training, the same, very similar to what I would have received at SAS Simonsburg. Things like how to lower a lifeboat, how to tie knots, how to march, how to salute, all that sort of basic training, but also specialized training. My basic training was 3 months. I expect his was as well. And then he did a further 5 months doing learning how to fire great big guns. And as a gunnery rating. Gunnery ratings were also the gunnery instructors were, of course, the parade, like a sergeant major on the parade ground. So that's why I always say I have a loud carrying voice because my father was a gunnery instructor. Now, smaller ships, destroyers, frigates, sloops, corvettes, etc., didn't have enough admin staff to organize pay and administration. And so those functions fell to the base that ship operated from. So the next entry we look at is, it says St. Angelo Havoc. That is, in fact, the Navy base in Malta is HMS St. Angelo. And the ship HMS Havoc was based there. She was an H-class destroyer, too small to have its own admin and pay, and so that was done by the shore base at Malta. That's a picture of HMS, the destroyer, HMS Havoc. And from 1936 to 1939, that is during the Spanish Civil War, HMS Havoc enforced the arms embargo around Spain to ensure that no arms were taken to either side. August 1939, she returned to Chatham, HMS Pembroke. And there, my father by that time was an able seaman, still with the SS, it's a short service. And he remained in Chatham until January 1940, when he got stationed onto his next ship, HMS Pembroke in brackets Hotspur. So she was HMS Hotspur operating out of Chatham. And she was an H-class destroyer. And my dad served on her perhaps the longest of all of the ships he served on, from 1940 right through to 1942. And they were at numerous naval bases, and that was really quite useful to see where he was. From 1940 through to September 1940, he was at Chatham, then got moved in October to HMS Cormorant, which is in fact Gibraltar, and then to HMS Nile, which was Alexandria in Egypt, and then to HMS Tana, which is in Kildini in Mombasa in Kenya. And during this time, you can see he gets promoted because it's during the war. He gets made acting leading seaman and acting petty officer temporary, etc., because they wanted experienced men as more and more new trainees came in. But during this time, HMS Hotspur saw much action in various theatres of conflict. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, just to mention some of the highlights. While he was based at HMS Pembroke, HMS Hotspur took part in the Battle of Narvik, where it was in a collision with HMS Hunter, and therefore had to be repaired at Chatham for quite a few months. While he was at HMS Cormorant, they formed part of the destroyer screen around Force H, or the Mediterranean Fleet, based there, including battleship HMS Warspite, and numerous other naval operations, including ramming the submarine, the Italian submarine La Follette. All of this I got by searching Google. Where was HMS Hotspur between this time and that time? What happened there? Tell us more about HMS Hotspur. It's using that research to find out. Also took part in some of the Italian battles against the Italian fleet, at the Battle of Cape Spartavento and the Battle of Cape Matapan. And while at HMS Nile in Alexandria, he assisted in the evacuation of the British troops from Greece, and also in the support of the military operations and the defense of Crete and evacuation of troops from there as well. I think he was one of some of the troops who went ashore to gather up all the troops and bring them back to the ship. And while there, he found a crashed German glider, and I know, which we've lost somewhere in the moves that we've had as a family, a whole pile of German navigating set squares and protractors and that sort of thing the navigator must have used. While also at HMS Nile, part of the inshore squadron supplying and supporting the Tobruk garrison, taking supplies through to them when they were besieged. And then there's a picture online of the few survivors from HMS Barnum. HMS Barnum was torpedoed by the U-boat 331, and one of the few survivors of the few survivors were picked up by HMS Hotspur, and you can see them climbing a grappling net up the side of HMS Hotspur, and that's a picture I've seen on the internet. So they were part of the destroyer screen for that battleship HMS Barnum. My dad was then transferred to Mombasa and then finally to Durban, where HMS Hotspur underwent a refit. Just to give you some brief details of HMS Hotspur, and that's a picture of her. 1,350 tons, 98 meters long, 10 meters wide, and at a draft of 3.8 meters. Maximum speed of 36 knots and a range of about 5,500 miles, nautical miles at normal speed. Obviously, if they want to go up to 36 knots, they're going to use a lot more fuel. The complement was about 146 in wartime. Their ammunition, their armament was basically 4 single 4.7-inch guns. They in single mounts, that is, there's only one barrel in each of these guns. There were also anti-aircraft guns and 2 above-water quadruple torpedo tubes. Basically, I think what that means is they can fire either to the port or to starboard. So no doubt they were sort of facing both directions, and they could fire up to 4 from each of those. And they carried depth charges also for anti-submarine warfare. My father was a gunnery rating, and he was captain of B gun on HMS Hotspur, and that's the B gun over there, the one directly below the bridge. If we carry on down his list, you will now see that he's the last 5 or 6 entries, say HMS Assegai, which in fact is Durban, and then HMS Africana, which is Simonstown. And during this time, he was based in these 2 bases. As a petty officer, he was in charge of the guards on the trains to and from Young Kempsdorp, where there was a camp holding many German POWs and other Germans who were felt to be a threat to the security of the country. And during that time, he passed through Kimberley, where my mother was serving breakfast at the station as part of the SAWAS, the South African Women's Auxiliary Service. And as they say in the classics, the rest is history. He married her in Cape Town in 1943 while he was based in Simonstown. But by the end of that year, 1943, by January 1944, he was drafted to HMS Hawkins. This is HMS Hawkins, an old World War I cruiser, built in 1917, well past her sell-by date by World War II. Before Tom Pratt joined her in 1944, she was based in Simonstown and used for convoy duty from Africa across to India and Sri Lanka. In fact, my dad, in January 1944, did one of those trips across to what was then called Ceylon. In February 1944, she returned to UK waters and was based in Belfast, and she participated in the D-Day operations at Utah Beach. I'll show you that in the next slide, being part of the Naval Bombardment Unit. Immediately after this, in fact, by the 15th of June, she was taken back to England, decommissioned, and then later broken up in 1949. With her decommissioning, Tom was drafted back to HMS Pembroke or Chatham, and there he remained until the end of the war. So here's a map of D-Day landings. You can see the different beaches. Here's Utah Beach, and here's Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, and those are the 5 beaches which were the landing places for D-Day. The bombardment happened early in the morning, started at 5:30 and ended by 8 on D-Day, and HMS Hawkins is there bombarding these 2 batteries at St. Martin de Reville and at Massey, and also later in the day at Point de Hoek near Omaha Beach. Tom Pratt left the Navy at the end of 1945. He was released Class A, and he was enrolled the very next day. He left on Christmas Day, 1945, and the very next day he was enrolled into the Royal Navy Fleet Reserve to complete his 5 years service there. It's a bit shorter than 5 years because he'd done extra time of his 7 years. But he came to South Africa to join my mother, his wife, and a year later he joined the South African Naval Forces, later the South African Navy, on the 11th of December 1946. And he became a gunnery instructor at the Navy Gymnasium at Saldanha. My sister was born in September 1946, and my mom moved up to Saldanha to be close to him. And she remembers sitting there with my baby sister at that point. So that's what my daddy, or my father-in-law, did in the war. Now, just a brief summary of what I've said. Getting an ancestors service record, that's only half the battle. UK records are at the National Archives in Kew, and at the moment, if you do find any there which are digitally available, you can download them for free during lockdown. Normally, they're £3.50 per document. I'm not sure what happens from Monday onwards when everyone else goes, in England, goes back to normal, Freedom Day, as they seem to be calling it. So they might be charging from Monday, I'm not sure. If you try and look for records post-1928, which are not in the archives, they're going to charge you £50, which is non-refundable. If not, that's, a lot of money in rands. And if they find no record of that person that you think was your serving in the whatever unit, then I'm afraid you've wasted some money. So South African military records, use someone like Dewald Nell. There's his email again if you want to make a note of that. He does charge, it's not free. It depends on the size of the document and the file, how thick the file is. I had one officer's file which was well over 400 Rand, but often they are only a couple of pages like Ronald Jones's was, and that'll be between 150 and 400 Rand. Once you have that file, you must search the internet. Use Google. Use known armed forces websites or books to find out more. Look at the different units, regiments, ships, histories. So it's type in, if you the 19th Squadron or HMS Hotspur into Google and see what comes up. Look and see what and where those regiments were during the time your ancestors were serving in them. Find out if there's a local organization of veterans, e.g. the Burma Star, the Royal Navy Association, and ask them. Use your ancestors' photo album. As I moaned about just now, many photos are not labeled. And can I suggest to all of you to write on the back of photos, not just in the album, because they fall out of albums, but write on the back of the album, back on the photo, what it is, so that in the future, your children's children can work out exactly. But sometimes you can guess. You know, if you see a pile of South African troops standing in front of the pyramids, you know they must have been in Cairo. And if they're at St. Peter's Square in Rome, you know they were in Rome. Now, this is an essential book. Dewald Nell recommended it to me. I thought, oh, well, where am I going to get it? I searched on the internet and suddenly I found it actually on the philatelist sites, stampssa.africa. And I see it's published by the South African Military Mail Study Group. It's 28 pages. It's very useful. It's a PDF format, and you can download it and look for those acronyms and abbreviations. There's been a whole series of South Africans at War, series of 12 books. A lot of them will be in your local library. I know, for example, I was looking up War in Italy for someone who served in the South African Air Force, but in the light anti-aircraft battalion. So volume number 8 for me was very important, just to have a look to see where he was part of the 6th Mobile Division. Those are some of the pictures on the back of one of the covers, showing you some of the books that were published. As I say, there's 12 of them. And you notice the 12th one says The Unknown Force, Black, Indian and Colored Soldiers during the 2 World Wars. Sources, I'm not going to go through all of these because I see I've been speaking for an hour already. But as I said, I've actually made a list of them all, and I've sent a copy of a PDF and in a Word document to Anne, and I've sent a copy to, I've got a copy here if anyone wants that, and I can certainly email it to you if you just email me. Can I just mention 2 things here? If anyone is looking for flight records of pilot training in South Africa, very good site. This one, a big table telling you exactly. I looked, for example, knowing about it, I looked up Air School 43, which is in fact in Port Alfred. I remember driving down from Grahamstown past. As you enter Port Alfred, it's right there, still at the airfield. It's still an air school, although it's now privately run, training private people to fly airplanes, and it's still called the 43rd Air School. A lot were trained in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as well. I think just to mention the last 2, these last 2 entries here, Hart's Army List. And this is a very useful list, and I'm very thankful to the National Library of Scotland for putting digital images of all of these online. They give you a page only per regiment, and it only lists the officers. It doesn't list the other ranks. But if you're and it'll give you it in order of, colonel, major, captain, lieutenant, ensign, etc., and their names and dates of promotion. So it's a very also useful document for all of that. The Navy lists I have mentioned, and those are also online and digitally available from the National Library of Scotland. I haven't been, nowhere do I have to subscribe or do anything. I just use that website and up it comes. Right, thank you. And there's my email address if you want to ask me for a handout of those sources that you can use. I'm going to stop sharing, and then if you have any questions, please feel free to, you must unmute yourself because I muted all of you, but if you want to ask questions, feel free to do that.
Derek, thank you very much for the most interesting talk. It was thoroughly enjoyable. I'm sure that there are people that have got questions, and so if anybody's got questions, please fire away.
Don't forget to unmute.
Hi, can I chat?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really very interesting, and I'm particularly interested in this because my dad was and his 3 brothers actually fought in Italy I think they were volunteers that went. So my dad was very good. He kept a lot of his documents, original ones, and of his father, who worked in Simonstown, also in Gunnery. And I have my dad's dog tags. Sure, I don't know what it's for. It's quite a thing to actually have, and to know that he actually wore those every day while he was. It's a very tangible sort of memory of where he was and what he did. And yeah, so thank you, because I do need to do a lot more research, and these links will help me. The one I'm actually looking for is more in his father fought in the Southwest African War, and he got some medals there. We've got the medals. I've actually got the original a document of the medals that he got. So I've got their numbers, my dad's number and his number. So I think I've got quite a good way of getting more information.
Yeah, go to Die Welt Nil, ask him, as I say, he will charge. It's not a free service. He has to go and take pictures and everything. And what he usually does is go and get how many pages there will be and then quote to you. And then you put the money into his bank account, and then he'll put it in Dropbox for you to pick up. But then the hard work starts, because you've got to work out all those acronyms and abbreviations and things. I see one of the questions in the comments was asking about the Cape Malay unit and 1806 Battle of Blouberg. I think maybe Jaco, you might know more about that. The unit, the Cape Malays who fought in the Battle of Blouberg. Is there anything in the archives about that? You'll have to unmute yourself, Jaco.
Okay, thanks.
There we go. Right.
To start off with, there's a number of books on the battle, and they have all the archive links, the information, the sources. A lot of it's under Batavian Republic, and you know what I mean, those type of records prior to the final British occupation, 1806.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's best to use the books and then with a footnote reference to archives. Just have a look on Google. It picks up quite a lot of the sources. If you look at Battle of, there's the 1795 battle, also the later one, first in Muizenberg and then the one above Cape Town. Yeah.
I know the Battle of Muizenberg, the castle, I think, have produced a little booklet about that. And
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. So that's your starting point. It's no use going to the archives. I won't be able to help you now.
Okay. And the other, I just thought maybe you knew some background. The other one is the Battle of the Axe in 1846. So that you might find British regiments listed quite easily under Hart's, who were serving in which regiments were in Cape Town in 1846, and take it from there. But I'm sure I've seen files with the Cape Malay and those sort of units that were known as the Cape Malays, etc.
Yes.
Around on some of the searches I've done. Thank you.
Derek, may I ask, I'm fairly new to this, and I'm wondering where do you start?
Where do you start?
I have a great-great-grandfather who was in the British Army in India and subsequently came to South Africa. He came to South Africa in about the 1830s, so he would have been serving in the British Army in the 1820s and 1830s. Do I start looking in the UK? Must I look in India? And how does one
both.
get?
I would say both, really. One of the places that I would look is one of those Ancestry or Find Your Past. They have a lot of military records. Ancestry, unfortunately, have put a lot of military records in a sub database called fold3.com, and you've got to subscribe separately to that, which is very irritating. But Find Your Past might very well have the record of, was he just an ordinary, I never know what the equipment.
He was an
officer. That'll be a lot easier to find. And certainly if you know the regiment, you can maybe look at Hart's Army list. You might still appear in that in the 18, because their first one is 1839. But he might still be in that. There's also a website called Phoebus, Families in British India Society.
FIBIS.
FIBIS, FIBIS. And that's a volunteer society which have put on databases from numerous. I think they're more moderner than the 1820, which you're looking at, but it might be there. You can try there. And then the British Library has the records of the old Indian Office. Births, marriages, deaths, all those returns being sent in to the British or to the Indian Office, and their archives have been placed in the British Library.
Great, thank you. That's at least a place to start.
Derek, it's Sheila Clover.
Sheila first. Yes, hi Sheila.
I have a couple of questions. One is the South African Medical Corps. My grandfather served in that in the First World War, but they seem to be joined with the Royal Army Medical Corps. Should I start with the South African Department of Defence and Centurion, or should I start with the Royal Army Medical Corps? That's the
I
first.
would actually send an email to Devolt and just find out if he's listed there.
Okay.
If he's listed as part of the South African Medical Corps, then his file will be there. I did a bit of research for one of Sherry's brother-in-law, the father of the brother-in-law of Sherry Wright, and he was in the South African Naval Forces, but seconded to the Royal Navy. So all his ships that he served on were in the Royal Navy and so on. So he had very much a Royal Navy record type layout, but he was definitely part of the South African. So he had a blended sort of record in Centurion. So I'm sure that might be the case here. If not found at all there, then maybe just do a search on the usual ancestry and find your past, because they've got military records.
And thank you. And then the second question was, my grandmother served in the First World War, and I've got 3 occasions where she was mentioned in dispatches, but I have no idea what she was mentioned for. How does one get that information? Because I seem to be drawing a bit of a blank at her regiment. So she was with the Queen Alexandra's
Nurses,
Imperial Medical Nursing.
Yeah, I know the crowd. Yes, maybe in the London Gazette, but I would say for mention in dispatch is not likely. But you never know. Or if you can find a regimental diary in the archives. So maybe the British Archives, at Kew, the Royal Archives, what do they call themselves? The National Archives at Kew, the TNA at Kew Gardens in London. They might, and they also have, which I didn't mention, it's on my printed sheet, but I didn't say it out loud. They have lots of research guides. So they can tell you, if you're looking for military records, 1, do this, 2, do that, 3, do the other, 4, it won't be here, it'll be somewhere else, and so on. So have a look at those guides at the National Archives.
Thanks very much.
Any other questions?
Derek, thank you very much. I think everybody's exhausted all their questions, and you've given us a lot of very interesting insight to where to go and look for things. We've had a very good attendance here this afternoon. I think we had up to 43 people. So it was a very worthwhile meeting. I'm sorry I can't give you the normal presentation, but we'd have to maybe... When the government lifts the ban on the booze, we can maybe get you the normal gift.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you
very much. So to everybody, we'll be online, and we'll send out messages in the future. It's one of our members that's going to talk, so it should be an interesting subject. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you soon in a month's time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks, especially Derek. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.